A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. We will begin today's program with the recitation of the Holy Quran by Tariq Malik.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. The translation of the verses I've recited just before you right now is as follows. I seek refuge with Allah from Satan the accursed. In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful. O ye who believe, be steadfast in the cause of Allah, bearing witness in equity. And let not a people's enmity incite you to act otherwise than with justice. Be always just, that is nearer to righteousness, and fear Allah. Surely Allah is all aware of what you do. Verily, Allah enjoins justice and the doing good of others and giving like kindred, and forbids indecency and manifest evil and wrongful transgression. He admonished you that you may take heed. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah, asana jaza. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum to all my dear brothers and sisters of the USA Jamaat who have taken time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar on behalf of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association of America. On behalf of this organization, which is an ancillary body of the Jamaat consisting of Ahmadiyya Muslim legal professionals, we welcome you to this special webinar on using law to attain racial justice. The Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association, by Allah's grace and mercy, is a body of over 60 legal professionals, which include licensed lawyers, and law students as well, and mashallah, a very growing body. And we are deeply committed to the protection of all marginalized and persecuted communities, and of course, in the pursuit of supreme justice and absolute justice, which defines our work. We're very grateful to have the direct guidance of our beloved Hazur Ayatollah, who has guided us in so many of our programs and has approved our ability to conduct this program. It's a very tense time right now in America, very anxious, and there are a lot of tensions and divisions in our cities all across America. 2020 has been a very difficult year on so many fronts. The tragic cases of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, so many others have brought to the forefront of our national conversation, our national conscience, the issue of racial persecution against Black Americans. We have convened a number of programs in the Jamaat to discuss this under the banner of Supreme Justice, and of course the Alliance for Absolute Justice, and a number of programs across the Jamaat. But this program that we're doing tonight is a little different. We're focused on trying to bring to each of you an education about the systems and structures of racial discrimination and persecution that exist within our own criminal justice system. There have been a number of programs that you've all participated in, very robust discussions, but tonight we really want to zero in on the system, the actual justice system, and how some of the issues that are plaguing our country are actually deeply rooted structurally in the legal system. So as a way to frame this discussion, I thought it would be appropriate to share this wonderful quote from our beloved Hazur, who of course has guided us in this very tense time. And in one of his addresses, he has mentioned that if we truly want peace in our time, then we must act with justice. We must value equality and fairness. As the Prophet of Islam, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so beautifully stated, we must love for others what we love for ourselves. We must pursue the rights of others with the same zeal and determination that we pursue our own rights. We should broaden our horizons and look at what is right in the world rather than what is only right for us. These are the means for peace in our age. So this very rich quote, among so much guidance that we've received from Hazur, guides our work as lawyers as well. I'm very delighted that we have convened a panel of experts to really discuss this topic in a variety of fronts. And we've divided the formal part of this presentation into three parts. First, we'll be talking about how people of color are disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system. And we're going to spend 20 or so minutes having a discussion with a few of our experts. And then we're going to shift to how people of color are denied full rehabilitation and political justice. This goes into the issues of voting rights and voter suppression as well. In the first part, we're going to cover the criminal defense system and bias in prosecution, among other things. And then finally, we're going to turn to how can we be prescriptive? How can we actually do something to obtain this goal of supreme justice that Hazur has outlined for us, that is so core to our essence as American Muslims? And how do we achieve this criminal justice that we all desire, a system that's fair, and political justice? How do we navigate through these very difficult waters? Joining us today in this panel, we have a number of experts. We have Abdul Latif Balanta Sahib, who is a Pennsylvania licensed attorney since 1990. He was a general civil and criminal practitioner for many years, has a lot of expertise and knowledge. He now works for a Ghanaian nonprofit. We're very delighted to have you, Brother Abdul Latif Balanta. We have also Sister Hamida Owusu, who is an immigration attorney in the Washington, D.C. area. She works with unaccompanied children, a terrific and prolific record. She's a graduate of Harvard University and Stanford Law School, worked in private practice and also in public interest work. We're very fortunate to have her with us. Mahmoud Ahmad is a commercial litigator who has more than a decade of experience in private practice. He's now in-house counsel for a Fortune 500 corporation. In addition to his very busy commercial work, he does a lot of pro bono work, including for criminal defendants. Sister Najia Humayun is a second-year law student at Berkeley Law School. She's from Dalton, Georgia. She's an editor on the prestigious California Law Review, one of the top law journals in the country, and has written about criminal justice reform. Ossama Saifi is a labor and employment defense attorney in Southern California. He previously served as deputy district attorney in Northern California, and in that role, he actually prosecuted hundreds of cases, ranging from domestic violence, child abuse, and drug-related crimes. He's based in Los Angeles. And Saif Rahman, who's a graduate of USC Law School. He served as a criminal public defender in Orange County for about 9 years. He's now in private practice. He's been doing this work for 15 years, and he's handled thousands of criminal cases. So we're very delighted to have this incredible panel, over 75 years of combined experience. We welcome your questions in the chat box on the question and answer panel. We have 2 ways to ask questions. You can do so in the question and answer box. You can also do so by raising your hand. We'll take a few live questions at the end. We have about a 45-minute to 50-minute conversation, and then we'll save about 20 or 30 minutes for questions and answers. We'll try our best to cover as much as we can. So I'm now going to turn to our first part and our first panel, and that's Abdul Latif, Saif, and Ossama. I'll turn to you, Abdul Latif. We're talking in this segment about the criminal justice system specifically, and how people of color fare through this system. If you can begin by actually educating all of us about people who aren't lawyers, who just have a sense of the criminal justice system, may have a certain idea about it, and there's maybe a certain ideal about what the system should be. But talk a little bit about what that ideal is and what the reality is, what the real picture is, given your experience.
When someone refers to the criminal justice system and says that it needs reforms, sometimes they're lobbying together all of the different vast facets of the justice system. For instance, there's definitely a need for bail reform, police reform, as well as prison reform. All of these are components of the criminal justice system, because someone who becomes introduced to it, they have to go through this at one form or another. For the purposes of my presentation today, I'd like to give just kind of a general overview of the criminal justice system in general, some of the theory which makes the American justice system the most advanced, and I would say the more the system that leads to justice, that could lead to justice more than any other developed nation. The theory of it, as well as contrasting that with the reality in terms of how it is actually practiced. And then I'll go back and I'll focus just on the bail portion of it. And my colleagues will take up from after the pre-trial session and go on to trial, giving you another perspective of it. But first, I would say that our system is the most advanced because it has embedded in it principles and standards which really, if they were practiced perfectly, it would make for a perfect criminal justice system. But because we're humans, and because our upbringing and our prejudices often creep into our decision-making process, the criminal justice system is no different. It just has greater consequences when our prejudices are seen to be in effect by the police or by the judge or by a prosecutor. First of all, some of the principles which would, if it were perfectly executed, which makes it a perfect system, starts with the presumption of innocence. In our system, everybody is presumed innocent, and you don't have to prove yourself innocent after being accused. You remain innocent all throughout the process. One of the problems with the system, though, is that once you're introduced to this system, you have to actually literally pay to keep your freedom. When I get to the bail portion of it, I'll talk about the onerous system that is placed upon people once they're introduced to the system. And of course, it is always disproportionately weighed upon people of color. That presumption of innocence, it begins from the time that you're stopped by the police. And I would point out that there are two ways that one can get arrested or introduced to the criminal justice system. First, it can be arrested because of some warrant. This is where a judge actually determines that some law has been violated, and they send, excuse me, they send a police officer or a sheriff to actually go to arrest you. That would be based upon some information that the police have done prior to presenting it to the judge, saying that we believe that this law has been violated, he's done this type of fraud, et cetera, and then the judge signs the arrest warrant. So in that case, the judge has already determined that you should be arrested. The other way that a person gets arrested is actually what I call like inaction arrest. Like if you're driving your car and you get stopped and you get arrested. I think that with all of the injustices in the system, I would also be remiss if I didn't give you some of my top 5 tips not to get arrested. But as I speak about the principles, we'll talk about how they work in theory, how they work in practice, and then what you can do to make them work for you, the system work for you. The inaction arrest, say you're driving along the road, and one of the first principles that the system has is that in order to be stopped by the police, he must have reasonable suspicion that some law has been violated. Our system says that police can't just go along stopping people for no apparent reason. He must have some reasonable suspicion. After he stops you, before he arrests you for something that he believes is afoot, some crime that's been violated, he must have what's called probable cause. Probable cause is that he believes that some law has been violated and that you are the person that has violated it, whether he may have seen you do something or whether he may see something in your car which indicates that there's criminal activity afoot, or whether he stopped you in pursuant to some crime that has happened somewhere else in the neighborhood or in the area, and he believes that you fit the description. In fact, this is probably going to be tip number 1. Tip number 1 to avoid being introduced to the criminal justice system is to make your car distinctive. You can imagine how police, when they're stopping cars, and if they see a vehicle fitting a description, they're never going to stop a vehicle that says on the side of it, love for all, hatred for none, as if that is the vehicle that fits the description of the getaway car, et cetera, et cetera. So even if it is a bumper sticker, you can do yourself a favor by giving the police officer something to see about you that's different than everybody else. They're trained to look for differences and to gather as much evidence as they can before making an arrest. Another one of the principles that our system holds true is that you don't have to incriminate yourself. You can remain silent. Tip number 2, one of the first things that a police officer does when he stops you, 9 times out of 10, he's going to ask you a question. Did you know why I stopped you? Do you know how fast you were going? These are questions which are designed to get you to admit something that he can use against you in court, that yes, you admitted you were speeding, that you was just in a rush, or yes, you failed to stop there because it was dangerous or somebody was behind you or whatever. The idea is that they're trying to get statements out of you. So tip number 2 is to never give any statements in response to that first question of the police officer. Tip number 3, the criminal justice system says that you have that right to remain silent. The bad part about remaining silent is that you can be arrested because you've remained silent. Some laws, and Maryland is one of those, says that if you don't agree to a breathalyzer or to agree to a sobriety test, which are statements that you're making, then you can be arrested for that. Tip number 3 to avoid being arrested is to have your friends who is attorneys, Attorney Khan, Attorney Balanta, whoever, on speed dial, such that if you are being harassed by a police officer and he doesn't tell you why he stopped you, but rather he's just investigating and looking at something, then you should have your friend on speed dial. You should call him and let him see that you're calling Attorney Khan, Attorney Balanta, and you should save our names as attorney such and such. The idea is to put that police officer on the defensive, or to let him know that you know people who know how he should behave. The next thing that I'll speak about with regard to the rights that we have before we are, if the system is working perfectly, and that is the right to counsel. You do have a right to counsel at every phase, even if you're in your car and you want to consult your attorney before you make any statement, you have the right to call him on the phone, same thing, but after arrest as well. The arrest after for some action, at that point you're actually going to be charged with something. And probably, let me give you tip number 4 first, or tip number 5, whichever one it is. One of the key things that you can do to extricate yourself, to make that police officer make a determination quickly as to whether he's going to arrest you or not, is to ask him, am I free to go? You can be detained for questioning, for identifying yourself. But after 20 minutes, 30 minutes, on the high side, 45 minutes in every state, the police officer has to either arrest you, bring in some charges for you, or let you go. He can't just hold you there indefinitely. By asking him that question, am I free to go? He's forced to the issue to make a determination. And then the last tip that I'd like to give you is that police officers that you'll encounter on the street are normally the patrol officers, and every one of them has a supervisor. If you feel that you're being detained improperly or not given the reasons for your detention, then you should ask for a supervisor. That means that he has to call his supervisor out there to the thing before he takes any other action. This will also unlikely get you arrested because it just makes for more paperwork. The supervisor is not likely or not eager to do paperwork on a small type of arrest. And these are the kind of harassments that we, people of color, period, quite often get. So next, let's go to being arrested. After you're arrested for some reason or another, then everybody's entitled to bail. Bail is the guarantee that you will come to court for the charges, to answer to those charges for which you're charged. When you talk about bail reform, on this chart right here, the one down the middle in orange is the one that most people think about when they speak about the need for bail reform. Because out of 100 people who are arrested, 34 people on average stay in jail simply because they can't afford the bail. And you'd be surprised that most bail, or a lot of bail for many charges, are less than $500. If you understand how the bail system works, is that when you're faced with a charge, you have an opportunity to post bail yourself. Let's say the average felony would may be about a $10,000 bail. And if you have appraised assets or property or cash that you can post that yourself, then you pay the $10,000 and you get that back at the end. If you can't afford to post a $10,000 bail, then you go to a bail bondsman. The bail bondsman will post he'll post it for you using an insurance policy or a bond, and you pay him a percentage. Most charge 10% of the cost of the bail, and that's a fee that you pay to the bail bondsman, and you're not going to get that back at the end of the trial. One of the problems with our justice system is that we have industrialized the bail system. Bail bondsmen are making a killing, insurance companies are making a killing, and it is something whereby the average individual doesn't understand how he can extricate himself from the system. And in fact, the system has him paying often. The system has him paying often just to stay into the system. One of the bail reforms that is taking place right now, and I would cite New York as one of the major leaders in this, is that they're trying to reduce the number of people that are detained because they can afford it by going all the way back to the very beginning and saying, instead of making this an arrestable offense, we're going to make this a citation. So where you see arrest, a citation, de Blasio has created a lot of offenses that are no longer arrestable, but rather they just citing, giving the people a fine or a citation for that. And that has drastically reduced the number of offenses for which people are in jail for which they cannot pay. The other way that bail reform is taking place is that the one at the very bottom, they're creating ways in which people can be released on non-financial grounds. For instance, he's given electronic monitoring as a way to ensure that people come to court. He said that some people can just report to a probation officer while their child is being heard. Because bear in mind, you're still innocent, but yet you're having to cough out money. The third area that bail reform is needed is in the paying of the bail phase, the one near the bottom, the second row from the bottom. At this phase, people have to pay bail, either post a cash bail or pay a percentage of it. The problem is they set the bail on your ability to pay, but it's only so low that they can go with regard to poor people. And even after you post the bail, then 34 jurisdictions out of the 50 require that a bail defendant pay fees such like the probation fees, the court costs, actually pay room and board for the time for which you were actually held in custody. These are some of the financial burdens that are placed upon a criminal defendant, even though he's still innocent. And then finally, afterwards, even after you've made it out of jail, the American Civil Liberties Union has been very successful in getting some of these jurisdictions to drop, or getting injunctions rather, to stop the implementation of some of those things, which says that, for instance, a criminal defendant has to pay those court costs, he has to pay those monitoring fees, and in some jurisdictions, Michigan, Alabama, Florida, if he's not able to pay the ongoing costs that go along with his monitoring, then he can be put in jail on those charges. Courts have determined that this is ransom, and so they're making reforms. Reforms are in place to reduce the burden upon poor and disproportionately Black people in many of these ways.
Well, Latif, that's a really excellent overview, and obviously the fluency by which you're speaking about this subject just speaks volumes because of your experience. And what I wanted to do now is actually bring our criminal lawyers to the conversation. So we have Saif Rahman, who's done thousands of criminal defense cases, and we have Ossama, who's also been on the prosecution side. So Saif and Ossama, bringing you into this conversation with Abdul Latif. Obviously, what Abdul Latif was talking about was just the process itself and what is at least how it's supposed to work. But beginning with you, Saif, I mean, obviously you've been doing this for 15 years. Speak a little bit about what drew you to this work, and then talk about how this works out in practice, and do people of color struggle through this and navigating through this system?
Assalamu alaikum. Yes, briefly just to tell you how I got into this, and then I can correlate that with the answer to that next question is, you know, I wanted to become a lawyer, but I had no idea what type of lawyer I wanted to be, even when I was in law school. And so I had never ever thought about criminal defense. As Ahmadi Muslims, a lot of us are very interested in public interest. Human rights, international human rights is something that touches our hearts and we think about. But I was very, very ignorant to the criminal defense system, and you know, just like most people, kind of what we see on TV is kind of what I thought there was. I happened to intern at the district attorney's office in Mobile, Alabama, my first year, between my first and second years of law school, and that literally changed my life. I had a friend whose dad was actually lieutenant governor over there, so I thought, okay, this will be interesting. It'll be educational, both as an illegal aspect, but also just in life. I had never been to the South. What happened there, I mean, literally changed my life. We went on ride-alongs with police officers, and in those ride-alongs, there were not any rules. I mean, there was literally officers who were trying to create high-speed chases. If a car pulled over, they would keep going. Anything they could do just to be, and I'll use the term, a bad boy. And it was something that, you know, myself, the other students I was with, we were a little uncomfortable with. But then when we went to court, and this I will never forget, I was in the arraignment court. So arraignment is the step just after Abdul Latif Saab was talking about when you get arrested and they place bail. And the arraignment is the first time you're ever in court as a defendant in which you're going to be facing charges. It's the first time you ever get to see a judge, perhaps get a lawyer appointed, perhaps if you're lucky be able to talk to the lawyer. And there in Alabama, I was in a misdemeanor arraignment court. It was low level. And the charge that they had brought up was all the cases that someone was charged with possession of less than an ounce of marijuana. This was 2003, mind you. But what happened next was they made a line when they called out the defendants, and it was 100% African Americans on the left side and whites on the right side. And then what happened next was a line of probation on the right side and a line of a year of county jail on the left side, 364 days of county jail on the left side. And it was one of those things where, you know, I was looking left and right saying, does anybody else not see this, see what's happening? And as Abdul Latif said, our system on paper is amazing. It's beautiful. I do this in my voir dire when I'm doing jury trials, where I talk about how my father who's from Pakistan, Afghanistan, they don't have these presumptions of innocence, and they don't have this right against self-incrimination and right against unreasonable search and seizures. However, in this country, as we'll see, African Americans don't either. And that's the unfortunate reality of what's kind of happened. And to kind of put some numbers to this, I apologize, I don't have a slide for these, but I wanted to just put this out there. What we're talking about with racial disparity, 38% of the prisoners in our country incarcerated in a jail or in prison are African American, 38%. And they make up African Americans make up 13% of our population, literally 3 times that amount. With regards to Latinos, they make up 15% of our population, 19% of our prison population. Black males born from in 2001 or after they have a 32% chance of being incarcerated at some time in their life, whereas white males have a 6% chance. But the one last stat I just want to give that really shows that our system is still systemically against them is that at this point, of all of the juvenile arrests, 46% of juvenile arrests are African American. African American juveniles make up 70% of their respective population in the general population, and 46% of juvenile arrests. And then as well, of those juveniles that are actually waived to adults, 41% of those that happen to be African American. So the numbers don't lie, and the numbers are so staggering that we have to have this question of what is going on if we have this beautiful, perfect system, or could be perfect system. And so what it lies is obviously lies in the people implementing it. So police is another thing that I think there's been discussions on in police reform, and the police have so much power at that time of arrest that they can make or break literally somebody's life. The other thing, though, I wanted to touch upon, and Ossama and I think can discuss a little bit more, is the prosecutors. The prosecutors in this country have just as much power as the police do. After an officer arrests somebody, he writes a police report that's forwarded to the district attorney. It is completely up to the district attorney if he wants to file that and turn it into an actual complaint or a case. There is no case, there's no filing, there's no complaint if the district attorney doesn't file that. And district attorneys are not, police officers in this country don't need a lot of training. You can go to a 6-month academy. You don't have to have any college education or anything. District attorneys in this country are attorneys. They've all been to undergraduate, they've been to law school, they've passed the bar, they're educated people. And so I really put the onus on them, and these are the people that I work with directly for the last 15 years across the desk, of trying to humanize my clients for them. And the sad thing is that they sometimes will pass through the filing and just look for the elements and look at the history behind it. So I wanted to just give a brief example of a case in which we have, let's say, 4 or 5 friends. They go out, and James is one of the younger ones. He's with them. He's 18 years old. He's with his 19, 20-year-old friends. They go out, and none of them have any money. They decide that they want to steal some soda, steal some candy, steal whatever it is from the corner store. All of them put stuff in their pockets. James is a little bit nervous about it. They're all doing it. He does it as well. They run out. The first 4 are able to get out by the time the teller sees, and he's now able to run and grab James, who's right when he's getting out the door, his arm is grabbed. James, what he does is he does naturally what any of us will do, is he shrugs his shoulder off and pushes back a little bit so that the grip is released, and he runs out. All 5 of them get arrested. James is now charged with robbery. The others are charged with petty theft. That's a misdemeanor. It can be handled in many ways, including informal ways. However, a robbery, which is a strike in many states, including California, is something in which he will not be given a low bail. He will not be released on his own recognizance, and he is now facing prison. And the difference between what he did and the others did was that there was a theft, but the theft was with force or fear. And there was a very fine line. And so prosecutors do have the ability, to charge that case as a misdemeanor or change the charge and these types of things. Unfortunately, and I think Ossama might be able to touch on this a little bit, is a lot of times we do have the biases and the intentions of prosecutors, like the cops, like the officers, who want to get stats, who want to move up. The same thing happens in the public defender's office as well. These people have very good intentions, but you move up in the office based on the amount of jury trial stats you get. But if you're thinking the best interest of this client might not be a jury trial, it might be to negotiate something in some way, shape, or form. However, the office is trying to push you with regards to getting stats. That becomes a difficult thing, and that's another problem that we have in our criminal justice system.
Yeah, well, that's. I mean, there's so much to digest there, Saif. But as someone who's in the system and seen these disparities play out in a system that's supposed to serve all of us, it's very disconcerting to hear that. Ossama, you've been on the other side, right? You've worked in an environment where you're prosecuting these crimes. Talk a little bit about the prosecution process and what you, if you feel that there are disparities in that process. Obviously, you're seeing it from the other lens that Saif is, and speak to a little bit about what Saif is talking about and your own experience.
Of course, Jazakallah. Well, I cannot comment to the prosecutors in the Deep South. I can, comment a little bit more about how things are done here in California. But as everyone's saying, we do have, alhamdulillah, a perfect system in theory. It's just in practicality, it doesn't actually work out that way. Prosecutors are supposed to be seen as ministers of justice. Their duty is to not represent the victim. Their duty is not to represent any particular person. Their duty is to represent society at large. So when I was prosecuting in California, my client was the people of California, the state of California. That was my client, and that's how we're supposed to do things. But even though we have this kind of perfect idea of a prosecutor whose job is to administer justice, to weigh all the facts, weigh all the evidence, see what's truthful and see what's not, unfortunately, the way that our legal system is built, which is an adversarial one, it's kind of natural to have situations in where the prosecutor wants to prosecute and the defense attorney obviously wants to defend. And that's kind of, in theory, what you'll see in a lot of prosecution, a lot of DA's offices, is that the goal is sometimes focused on to prosecute, and sometimes not weigh into consideration the importance of justice. That's not to say that that's not constantly reminded and impressed upon you as a prosecutor. When I would go to the CDAA conferences, the California District Attorneys Association, one of the largest associations of district attorneys, we would always be reminded that if we failed to do our job properly, we were in one of the few professions where, doing so isn't meant that you would be fired, but it meant that you would be charged with a crime yourself and then possibly facing that same felony that you're trying to impose on other people. So there's this constant stress that you want to make sure you're giving over everything that you have. You don't want to withhold any evidence. You don't want to act in a way in which you are, prosecuting somebody for the sake of prosecuting and not looking at the entire scope of things. You really want to do things for this idea of justice. But as Saif was mentioning, prosecutors have a lot more training. They come in a way that's a little bit more advanced than police officers. But even though, prosecutors have that training, it still is a lot of power at a time when you may not be fully able to kind of understand that power. I think I was 25 or 26 when I was first being sworn in by the DA and had my own badge, just like a police officer. I just didn't have a gun, but it had a little bit more power. And you can really use that power to make a lot of good, or to, further your own end and use this as a bit of a kind of ego drive. And
Ossama, we see that, right? We see that right now,
yeah,
playing out in trying to intervene in these high-profile cases that are in the headlines. The discretion that prosecutor has in a particular city to go forward or not, to go after police officers who may have committed excessive force so brazenly, yet there's still some reluctance, or there's still some review over those charges. I know some of the questions coming in the chat have talked about that as well. So I think that's right, and you've done a good job of explaining a bit about how you see it from that vantage point, but it's obviously eye-opening to see that even those who are serving the system, in theory, trying to create and mete out justice, there's still these disparities. I want to shift a little bit now into we talked about the criminal justice system briefly in these 15 or 20 minutes. You have a little sense of the disparities that exist, a little sense of how those who serve within the system struggle within it. But there's an equal and very concerning issue in 2020 that we've seen, and this has gone on for so many years, and that's political justice. And I'm bringing into the conversation here Mahmood and Abdul, you as well. So if we go back to our discussion, Mahmood, we talked a little bit about the criminal justice process, but when we think about Hazur's advice for us, right, and this is advice that we've received recently about trying to attain supreme justice, Hazur has talked specifically about this problem. Why don't you spend a few minutes walking us through it?
Sure. So I think I wanted to kind of set the stage by addressing sort of the elephant in the room, which is I think oftentimes there's a perspective, and I think it's fairly widespread, even unfortunately within the communities from which many of us hail, immigrants from South Asia and elsewhere, that the political system in the United States is sort of, there's a lot of cynicism, I think, around the political system, and the idea that your vote doesn't really matter, and voting doesn't really ultimately have an impact, and the government is sort of always going to remain the same regardless of what you do. And I think that the instructions that were received by Abid Khan Saab from Huzur and published in the Review of Religions, and for those of you who have not yet read the full article from which these excerpts are drawn, I urge all of you to do so, as it is extremely enlightening and inspiring. But I pulled out some excerpts here to really emphasize just how important the democratic process, of which voting is an enormous component, is to the idea of how we unlock justice for people of color in the United States. So if you look at the first quote, Huzur specifically instructs that African Americans and all of the minorities who are marginalized and have faced injustice have to use their democratic rights. So he's imploring them to use their democratic rights. And it's not just about the presidential election, but about every, whether it's a municipal office or a statewide office, at every single level. And then finally, Huzur has this, tremendous insight about how there may have been a Black president, but if you look across the spectrum of society, are you really seeing proportionate representation? Are you really seeing African Americans and people of color represented across the board and at every level, right? Across, different elements of society. And the truth is that that's not happening, and that it is only when it does happen that they will be able to affect society in the direction, to improve the rights of people of color. So I wanted to put that out there just to kind of contextualize why this discussion matters, right? So moving on now, and so saying, okay, well, Huzur said, they should exercise their right to vote. Well, then that ends the issue, right? Well, it doesn't. Although, all Ahmadis, all African Americans, all people of color have to try to overcome, every obstacle that's possible to get to the ballot and to vote. Nonetheless, we have to acknowledge there are very significant obstacles to that voting process. And, to put this in historical context, until the 1960s, African Americans in this country were prevented from voting altogether. Until the Civil War, they were prohibited from doing so. Between the Civil War and the 1960s, there were things called poll taxes, where essentially you had to pay your way to the polls, which made it impossible, practically speaking, for most African Americans to actually vote. Now, those systems of barriers continue to be in place to a significant extent today. And I want to talk about a couple of examples. The first example is the disenfranchisement of people who have been through the criminal justice system. So you just heard for 15 or 20 minutes about how people of color are disproportionately caught up in this justice system, how someone like the gentleman who may have had the slight shove at the end of the theft is suddenly a robber and a felon. And in those situations, there remain states in which once you're convicted as a felon, you're never able to vote for the rest of your life. Even if you've paid your debt into society, even if you're out of prison, you're still not able to do so. And because so many of the people who are serving in our prisons that have been convicted are people of color, this has a disproportionate effect on people of color. The second kind of, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to highlight some of the important points. The second barrier that I would highlight is something called racial gerrymandering. Many of you may have seen these kind of ridiculous maps that exist where congressional districts are drawn in ways that don't look logical at all, but rather are designed to boost, either party's representation. If it's a Republican led state, then they may try to essentially rig the election in their favor and vice versa. And one of the things that happens here is that oftentimes people of color are effectively shunted into a single district. And so you'll have one minority majority district, and then you'll have a number of districts around it. And what that means is that as a minority, you really only have influence over that one district, which is the minority majority one, and all the surrounding ones, if you happen to be a person of color in those districts, your voice is going largely unheard. So this is another example of how the voting power of African Americans and people of color is significantly diluted, is through racial gerrymandering. You want to move to the next slide. This shows the criminal disenfranchisement that we talked about a little earlier, how there remain, some states, including, Arizona, Kentucky, even Maryland, Tennessee, states where people continue to be disenfranchised even after they've served criminal convictions.
Yeah. And I want to give Abdul Latif an opportunity to chime in on this because you obviously have been following this issue, Abdul Latif, and we're very close to an election, and a lot of these things are going to litigation. What are your observations in looking at this map and looking at this issue?
As Mahmood pointed out, there are some states, very conservative states, that deny an individual the right to vote permanently once he's been found guilty of a felon, and there are 11 of them, as you see. I was curious to see which of those are red states and blue states, and as could be expected, I saw many more red Republican states that have these onerous, difficult, punitive, life-changing punitive status for an individual who's committed a crime. The idea behind the criminal justice system is once you introduce it, the whole idea of the criminal system is to deter others from doing what you've done. It is to provide retribution, payback for what you've done, and then provide rehabilitation once you have been found guilty. Our system is totally lacking in with respect to the third arm, with regard to the rehabilitation portion. They are warehousing people, and of course, people of color are disproportionately warehoused, but they provide no opportunity to try to provide them with education, meaningful education, trades and skills, so that they can come out. In most cases, they come out much more hardened criminals than they were when they went in. Another criticism of our system is that the prison industrial complex itself is a profit-making industry. There are many private prisons which charge per individual more than what costs to educate that person through a college. They charge more than that to warehouse him. And it only adds insult to injury that once he's released, that he has to pay those restitution, those costs, and then not being able to participate fully in society. So I think society admits that they're not rehabilitating him by denying him the right to vote when he can't participate in the main way in which one expresses his civic duty.
And this is 2020. I mean, this is 2020 America. And the level of injustice, I mean, the systemic issues here are staggering. Mahmood, we wanted to point to one more here.
Yeah.
Please continue.
So this is a really big one, and I think a potentially influential one in the upcoming election. That many of you may have heard about this: the requirement for voters to present an ID when they go to the polls, which, you know, in theory sounds very even-handed and equal and not problematic. Many people will say, well, it prevents voter fraud. This is an argument that's often made. In practice, voter fraud is virtually non-existent uniformly through a lot of research. But instead, what these voter ID laws do is they operate as a modern day poll tax, because the reality is that, as you'll see here, there are 21 million Americans who don't have IDs for a variety of reasons. And that includes 25% of all African Americans. So again, not 25% of that 21 million, but rather 25% of all African Americans in this country don't have an ID, right? And there's a variety of reasons why that is. It's hard to get to the MBA. So many times they don't drive, many times they have other obstacles, and as a result, they don't have IDs. Now, what does this mean in practice? Well, it means that, you know, many of these 25%, if they live in a state that has a strict voter ID law, they can't vote. And to give you an example, you know, in the state of Wisconsin, which everyone knows is a battleground state, in the previous election, there was a research study that found that there were 17,000 voters who were registered to vote across the cities and counties of Milwaukee and Madison, which are two big cities with big African-American populations here in the state of Wisconsin. And they were deemed ineligible at the polls on that day in November of 2016 because they did not have an ID. And the margin of victory in the presidential race in Wisconsin was 23,000 votes. And so, you know, if those people had been eligible, that margin of victory may have looked very different, and may, you know, the race could easily have gone the other way. And so
just to put a fine point on that, I mean, you know, we talk about the federal election, but, you know, the way that governance and the way the system works is every state is in contention.
Yes.
Every state matters. Every local jurisdictions matter. Precincts matter. So when Hazur is talking about the participation in the political process, he's very much speaking of this systemic problem, which is not just a problem in 2016. This has been a problem that's gone on for many, many decades, and it's just manifesting itself in a very perverse way. So these are barriers to voting. This is political injustice. It really disproportionately impacts people of color. These are facts. These are not contentions. These are facts. And it's very important as Ahmadi Muslims living in America for us to understand objectively what is the situation. And I want to turn now to our final part, and then I really am eager to hear from all of you. And we have a number of questions and hands raised as well. And that is, you know, we talked about the criminal justice system and its disparities briefly in whatever time we have, and the political injustices. So turning to you, Sister Hamida and Sister Najia, I really want you to, you know, guide our viewers and all of us on how do we maintain a sense of optimism? How do we move and navigate through this very sobering reality? How can we achieve the goal of supreme justice in the United States, given these statistics and given these struggles? So Hamida, I'll let you begin. Hamida, by the way, has she worked in private practice for years as well, one of the top law firms in America, after studying at Stanford Law School, and has worked also in the judicial system. She's worked for judges and now has switched to public interest, representing unaccompanied children. So she brings a vantage point of the private and public sector as well. So Hamida, the floor is yours.
Jazakallah, and I think our co-panelists have spoken, you know, beautifully and very strongly about how injustice can and has crept into our social and political institutions. And there is a huge reaction that I think is clear to the eye after George Floyd was killed, after the Jacob Blake shooting, that you've seen these protests, you've seen the outrage over the fact that the color of one's skin alone can be fatal. And in hearing all of this, Najia and I, we wanted to think about our role as lawyers and soon to be lawyers, and also the role of any Ahmadi and what we can do to achieve absolute justice and to really answer the call in the Holy Quran in chapter 5, verse 9, to be always just, because that is near to righteousness.
And that being said, we have to ask what the role of the law truly is in creating social change, because as we've heard from our previous panelists, sadly, the law is not always synonymous with justice. And in reality, the law is a very inherently conservative profession, because the way case law works in the American legal system is all based on precedent. And we have to think critically about what that means when precedent in our nation often meant upholding racism, for example. And as lawyers, in many ways, we're automatically working within the system rather than challenging it. And sometimes the work we're doing can be referred to at most as harm reduction work, which is helping people who have been negatively affected by the ills of our legal system. But all of that being said, it's not all negative, because we as Ahmadi Muslims have the unique opportunity to think creatively and critically about the law and about how we can leverage the law for the goal of supreme justice as described by Huzur, by doing things such as working in partnership with marginalized communities.
And I think Amjad, you said this very well, that we have to be both realistic and optimistic, that the law is a very noble profession. It's certainly what drew me to wanting to become an attorney, but to recognize that it's not immune from the social issues that we've seen in the law itself, the legal profession itself. There's also been really big pushes to improve diversity and inclusion in our own ranks in terms of gender representation, improving racial representation, and making sure that we step into the role that Najia was talking about uplifting marginalized voices in our work and in society.
As lawyers, one tendency that the profession has is to turn us into gatekeepers of the law, but it's important for us to actively counter that mentality and to make it our goal to actually make the law accessible to people who've been historically denied its protections or in reality oppressed by it.
Exactly. So at the core of our conversation and in thinking about what action we can take, which is what we're going to turn to next in our segment, is to really ask all of ourselves, for every lawyer, every person that's listening on the call as well, to think about how we should all have a care for the quality of justice in our country in every way that we touch the legal system. So whether you're working in the criminal justice system, which is what the majority of the conversation on this call has been about so far, but whether you work in immigration, education, if you're in policy, if you're working with corporate businesses and transactions, you're dealing with legislation, we have to challenge our ideas about what the law is for, or even that it's inherently fair, in order for us to be able to pursue supreme justice in our lives and in our work, which is the Holy Quran verse that is up on the screen now, because many of the issues the panelists have touched on are systemic, and they can feel very overwhelming and intractable. But in taking the steps to first change our own minds and our own points of view about innocence and guilt in the American system, and educating ourselves about the history that our co-panelists have talked about, and the ways that our laws can reinforce these inequalities, is a really important first step. And then as Ahmadis, to also think about the ways that we can incorporate empathy and compassion and forgiveness into our work, and to aspire to the ideals that are in this verse of the Quran, to really seek a way to enjoin justice and to do good to others and to give like kindred.
And Hamida, you've done such a wonderful job, both of you, of kind of mining the key concepts here in terms of, as custodians of the law, working within the system. It behooves us as Ahmadi Muslims to make sure we're not just working and serving the system, but we're improving the system. And also it makes us shift our paradigm and our mindset. You just spoke eloquently about what is innocence, what is guilt, and how is that understood in the system. To that end, we received guidance from Hazur, and Hazur very beautifully spoke about this very point. He's talking about this idea of innocence and innocent lives matter as a concept. And he said, the term innocent lives matter is a very broad term based on the Holy Quran, which says to kill an innocent person is akin to the killing of all mankind. And this is key, what Hazur says. He says it does not mean, the term does not mean that those who commit low-level crimes or who may be forced into error due to the circumstances they have grown up in, where they have been denied opportunities and justice, are not deemed as innocent. In fact, if they are forced to commit such crimes to feed their families or to exist, then they are very much innocent. Hazur also says the only people who are not innocent are those who have power or wealth and use it to persecute, to brutalize and perpetrate grave injustice, and who deny people their rights. So what we understand in this system to be guilt or innocence as the law defines is not what our faith, what Islam defines. And we must be mindful of that when we look at our circumstances. So please continue.
Yeah, that's a great point, because there's actually this huge disparity between our criminal justice system's determination of who's innocent and guilty versus the conception that Hazur has taught us, which teaches us to broaden our mindset and to think about the circumstances, like you mentioned, of poverty and systemic inequality that lead people to commit these low-level crimes rather than just judging people without knowing their background. And additionally, as Ahmadi Muslims, we're lucky to have the blueprint for the ideal justice system at our fingertips through the explanations of our Khalifas. So there's one book by the fourth Khalifa that explains in detail the verse that's on the screen right now. It's called Absolute Justice, Kindness, and Kinship. And it explains how the Islamic legal system actually very beautifully allows us to exercise our judgment to use these three different levels of justice. And one example I think of that, just to show how Islam applies this to the criminal legal system Islamically, is the Islamic concept of the death penalty. It gives the family of the victim of a murder the option to exercise whichever of these three levels of justice they feel is fitting to their situation. So for example, the family of the victims could decide to exercise adl by doing capital punishment. Or they could choose ihsan, kinship, by taking the option for blood money. Or they could reach that third level of ita'izil qurba by completely forgiving the person who committed the murder. And I think that's something that's really beautiful, because it actually gives power to the family of the victim and the community, which is a concept that's referred to as restorative justice. And even though that's something that's very alternative to the adversarial, like, American criminal justice system, it is something that's been picking up here as well in the Western legal systems. But I think it's cool that Islam implemented that 1400 years ago. And again, going back to a previous point, as Ahmadi Muslims, it's important for us not to judge people who commit low-level crimes or end up in trouble for low-level crimes. We should not only think critically about what drove them to commit those crimes, but we should also truly have empathy with them. Because if we think about the first Ahmadi missionary in America, Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, peace be upon him, some of his first converts in America were actually detained people. So we should definitely have empathy with them and strive to have that inner revolution of changing our conceptions of innocent and guilty to the way that Hazur has described them to us.
And so I think that when we're thinking about taking that perspective, taking this Islamic perspective and implementing it in our work and in our actions, I think it's very astute that Hazur has said that, and has really held up participation in the democratic process, because these are structural problems. But it's also important to remember that it can be changed. How we define crime, how we react to crime. We've talked about low-level offenses, but even the worst that you can imagine, right? We think about how the law can be slow to change and how marginalized groups may not have access to circles of power, but that's just a function of what the system is now. We can change and can adjust, you know, just how we are allocating crime and punishment, and also resources that we allocate to supporting the members of our society who need to be lifted up and may need those resources for education, for healthcare, in any way that you can imagine, that we can find different ways to allocate those burdens outside of the criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm. So take us, Hamida and Najia, towards a prescription, a path of concrete things that folks who are entering the legal profession, who are working in the legal profession, and even those who aren't in the system can do to take us to a better place.
Sure. Well, one of the things that we've already talked about, our co-panelists have already laid out, is that at the time before you're even convicted of a crime, you may be subject to a very punitive element of the system with things like pretrial fees and bail and the need to pay bond. And when we better understand how people are funneled into the system, it hopefully pushes us to want to equalize the effects of being charged with a crime, particularly for people who may already be struggling under the burdens of the system or struggling with poverty. And there are a number of organizations that have established bail funds in local communities and at the national level. And the Jamaat's Alliance for Absolute Justice is also committed to advocating for bail reform. So looking for those opportunities to participate in the local national level and also to join in the Jamaat's efforts to pursue changes to the bail system is really important.
And another way that we can take action is to support legislative activism against felony disenfranchisement, which was already described earlier. But just to reiterate, 6.1 million Americans literally can't vote because of a felony conviction. And 1 out of every 13 African Americans have lost their voting rights due to this system of felony disenfranchisement, compared to only 1 in 56 non-Black voters. So we can support legislative efforts which are happening in different states to restore voting rights to former felons.
Mm-hmm.
And one area in particular that lawyers can have a very significant impact is with criminal record expungement. And expungement actually removes arrests and convictions from a person's record as though they did not happen. There's also an alternative called sealing, which stops the record from being accessed by the public. And it's a really important avenue towards changing someone's life because, as our co-panelists have talked about, even if you're arrested, there's been no conviction, there's been no trial, the fact of that arrest can be so limiting in terms of being able to access financial aid for education, being able to seek job opportunities, having access to affordable housing, your voting rights, which we've highlighted numerous times. And in taking on these cases, unfortunately, what we've seen is that the cost of just preparing these papers and filing for expungement in court can actually be very prohibitive for people who are struggling to find work or may be limited because of their existing criminal record. And that was something that I saw when I was working in Stanford's community law clinic, even as a law student. I worked on criminal expungement cases and would have clients who maybe had committed crimes maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Maybe they were 18, 19, or they were older and they had since turned their lives around, but they were still being punished by the system because they couldn't access these resources. They couldn't go to school. They couldn't find jobs to support their families. And just getting expungement done was something that was really, really life-changing for my clients. And so working towards these rehabilitative points of view that are embodied in the Quran and Huzur's instructions, criminal expungement pro bono work is something that is a very tangible effect that lawyers can participate in.
Well, Jazakallah, very enriching. I want to now turn to questions. We have several in the Q&A box. We also have some hands up. Why don't we start with some hands? I think Ali Murtaza Saab, you have a question. Our technical team can unmute you. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Yes, as I was listening to the beautiful explanations that had been given by the panelists, I could not help but think about the concept, is justice really blind? You know, as an African-American person in America, it's like you're born with three strikes against you. So when we are being, you know, when we're going through society and life and certain kinds of infractions takes place, and you feel like, how do you combat this concept of racial profiling to the extent that like you're black and you're guilty as soon as like you're being brought before the authorities, and then furthermore, if you're playing by the rules, you're doing everything by the rules, but at the same time, if the deck is stacked against you, how do you combat that type of implicit racism?
Very good question, Ali Saab. I'll open it up. Abdul Latif, why don't you start?
Oh, I'd love to take a crack at that. Ali thinks like I think as well, and his analysis is the same type of quandary that I found myself in as a young practitioner. I began this journey in practicing law thinking that the system was going to be fair, and that me as an attorney, I'd have an equal shot at getting off an innocent person just as I would as my white counterparts. And one of the biggest lessons that I actually learned it in law school. Very quickly, the law school has trial bar, which is like a simulated trial type of scenario where you practice. You try a case that's based upon fictional facts. In my second year of law school, I was able to organize the trial bar so that the students were actually arguing a case, and there were so many of us that they had about 8 rounds before you get to the finals. The previous year, one of our stellar African-American brothers made it to the finals, but he got robbed by a real white judge. In the finals, we always put a judge there to hear the case of the students, but going through the rounds, you're just judged by your peers. So when I was given the opportunity to arrange the trial bar my year, I made sure that I had a black judge sitting up there. And one of my colleagues, on his own, he weaved his way all the way through all of the rounds, and he did very well. And when he got to the finals, and he was faced against a white attorney. There was only 5 of us in our class. But when he was facing that white attorney, and that white attorney was facing the white judge, the black judge up there, I could see that person was deflated, that they didn't have it in them. They felt as if the deck was stacked against them. They felt against that there was something between the black attorney and the black judge that they could never understand. And this is something that I experience every day in trying cases. So it's not blind, not either for the defendant nor for the attorneys who are supposed to be arguing the cases. And it's something that you can't legislate though. You can't pass a law that says, don't discriminate on the basis of your past experiences in Alabama, et cetera. What it requires is some other moral compass, which enables you to say that you're gonna do justice or treat people with kindness, with respect to some higher calling. And this is where religion comes in. Still to this day, in most courts, you have to swear on the Bible. If you want to swear on the Quran, you got to bring your own. But the idea is that if judges had a religious bent, that is, they're doing it because God is looking at them and they're going to be judged, then maybe they would judge with a little bit more equity.
Yeah, years ago when I was, very, very well put, Abdul Latif, we're going to go to a few more questions. Or years ago when I was working for a judge and we worked on death penalty cases, and there were death penalty cases involving people of color. One line stood out to me, the judge would say often is, Lady Justice may be blind, but she doesn't wear earplugs. So this idea is that, you know, you could say that justice is blind, but are you really getting a listening audience? Are you really getting a fair process? And that we see that all the time as practitioners. We have a number of hands up. I'm gonna take a few questions, and these will be pretty rapid fire, and I'll field them to panelists because we want to stay on time here. Ibrahim Naim asks, much of our reference to individuals caught in the criminal justice system is characterized as male. Please give a perspective of the impact of that system on women, both as inmates and the effect of not having available fathers or marriageable mates. So sisters Hamida and Najia, if either of you want to tackle that.
So I'm not a criminal attorney, and so my experience is probably not nearly as deep as my co-panelists, but I do remember, again, I was a law student working in our community law clinic, taking cases as a student under supervision. And when I was working, at least on criminal expungement cases, I would say that my experience with women who had been in the system, women who typically were people of color, was very similar. They may not have experienced necessarily the same level of police surveillance or violence, but they had experienced frequent incarceration, the effects of poverty because of their lengthy records. And you know, that disproportionate impact, I think, is not different. And to the extent that I had clients who maybe only had very few infractions or maybe juvenile convictions on their records to be expunged, they had seen the impact on their community. They had seen their brothers and friends and fathers dealing with a very, at least in the county that I was working in, California, which was known for very difficult policing and disproportionate policing. It was an effect that was clearly seen even by women in the community.
Thank you for that. Let's go to Sister Moeed Anderson. I see a question, but also I think a hand may be raised. Can our technical team, unmute the line? Sister Amtul, you can ask your question.
Yes, assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Now, we have several high-profile cases of social injustice due to the internet, all at one time. They're blaring before us. So can either of you help us understand how the criminal justice system is being used to affect justice in any of these cases?
Very good question. Saif, you want to take a shot at that?
Welcome. Just so I can be clear with regards to the question, the current cases that are going on, are you talking about the videos and the fact that they've been recorded? I'm sorry, I didn't.
I'm not talking about in particular about any of the cases, but we have several high-profile cases. Some of them were mentioned at the onset of this program, and they continue. The last one that is the high-profile case is from Kenosha. So I'm asking how the criminal justice system is being used to affect justice in any of these cases.
Well, we will wait and see for these ones. What I can tell you is, these high-profile cases are high-profile for, I think, one reason, and the one reason is that we saw them on video, right? There's no denying that difference and the impact it has when we actually see these. But I like to point out to prosecutors and to other people and to my friends when we discuss this that these horrendous acts and these arrests and these murders of young African-American men and women have been happening for a long time, and we just haven't had the video. Think about how many. I mean, one of the main things that we really would push for as public defenders is to make sure that the officers actually turn on their body cameras. And many times they'd be turning them on and turning them off. And finally, we have some reform, and I think there's a lot of reform going on in a lot of different states of requiring officers to keep their body cameras on all the time and not even allowing them to be able to turn them off. And good officers, good cops want those cameras on for the very reason to protect themselves. They're not out there doing anything wrong, then they have nothing to worry about, and that protects them. So with regards to these these cases that are coming up, hopefully, I think with the political climate and the knowledge, the fact that we're even doing this presentation right now will hopefully help. And we have to remember, we didn't talk too much about juries, but the jury pool in this country is supposed to be your peers. And unfortunately, a lot of people that are not allowed to serve, that are allowed to vote, that have prior felony convictions, that have actually lived real lives, are also not allowed to serve on juries. And so you see that how the system is rigged in that way. So hopefully these changes will come along with the prior, the felony disenfranchisement. One state already just recently, about 3 weeks ago, Florida voted that will allow felons to now vote once they pay any fees that they owe. So hopefully there'll be some changes because of these high profile cases. And one of the things that I think, going back to what Abdul Latif was talking about to protect ourselves, is getting video cameras or dash cams put on our cars. They're $40, $50 now, pretty cheap. And that can be very, very helpful. And I would tell an officer anytime you get pulled over, that officer, I'm recording this. I have it recorded.
Mahmood, you want to add a thought to that?
Just that very quickly, 2 or 3 thoughts. One, I talked about political justice and the importance of representation that Huzur highlighted. And if you look at what's going on in Minnesota with the George Floyd case, it's notable that the state's highest law enforcement officer, the Attorney General, is an African-American, and actually a Muslim African-American, Keith Ellison. And he is taking a very high-profile role in bringing that case forward and prosecuting it, even though it's going to be a difficult prosecution. So that's one way in which I think these kinds of issues of representation can make a lot of big difference. The other point I would make quickly is there are structural barriers to holding police officers who are committing these types of offenses accountable. And those include something called qualified immunity, which really puts police officers on a different footing than the rest of us. And they're judged differently than the rest of us, not by the same standard of justice, but by a much more lenient standard of justice when they commit offenses. And so there's an opportunity here to really, take a fresh look at whether or not those laws that are put in place to currently protect police officers really make sense, or whether the playing field is unfairly tilted in favor of the police officers and against, what the people, the very innocent people the system is supposedly supposed to protect.
Yeah, thank you. Very good thoughts. Rafiq, friend, are you on? And you can ask your question. We can unmute you.
Assalamu alaikum. It's an excellent program. I'm really appreciating all the wonderful comments by your esteemed panel. I worked in the criminal justice system. I worked for one of the judges here in Philadelphia for, nearly 20 years. And the disparity is just unbelievable. So, this whole idea of justice and being blind and so forth and so on it's ridiculous. I've always looked at, these guys all have the same black book in Pennsylvania. And if you go across county lines, that the convictions are so different. So in Philadelphia, it might be a slap on the wrist. In Montgomery, Delaware, Bucks County, Chester County, it might be, you might get time in jail in the state penitentiary for the same crime in Philadelphia that it's a slap on the wrist. So the disparity in the use of the book and the legislation is just, I know, we want to try to change legislation, but when it comes down to the individual and them actually making a decision as a judge, even when they instruct juries and jury cases, the way that the judge instructs the jurors is, all based on life experiences. It's a lot. It's just not the law. So in saying that, we got a big mountain to climb. So I like the idea of, trying to deal with it from a legislative standpoint. That's something that's really good. But let me say something about voting and the importance of this vote in this upcoming election, because this president has appointed 190, close to 200 federal district judges, and none of them were people of color. So to say that, it's a lot to really try to pull together. It's going to take a lot of time, but I think that, another area in closing that, we need to consider in terms of legislation is these police officers that do these horrific crimes, they got to be made accountable. So here in Pennsylvania, when we met with the governor, this is one of the things we said to him: listen, we want you to change this legislation so that police officers become accountable when they, do the things they do. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Rafiq. As always, really insightful, and you're doing so much grassroots work in Philadelphia. Nusrat Bashir asked a question which I can answer here quickly. She says, what does our Jamaat plan to do to counteract these injustices, especially in voting, since Azur is stressing this? Can we do transportation to help people get identification, perhaps allocate funds to help people pay the fees associated with this? I think I got the full extent of that. And a very good question, Sister Nusrat. And there's an Alliance for Absolute Justice, which is a very important body that the Tabligh department has started. Hazur has approved that name, and they're working on these exact things, working on trying to create the right support to exercise the democratic process. We are getting close to the 2-hour mark, but I want to take a few questions and then we'll close. Raheel Tayop, you can ask your question. Raheel will unmute your line.
Assalamu alaikum.
Please go ahead.
So my question is, I'm an undergrad right now with the intention to go to law school. If we're interested in this type of field, what is the route or what type of law should we be looking for?
In the interest of time, I'll just keep it quick. I mean, everyone here has gone through law school, and not everyone necessarily went to go for a particular field. So you have to go through law school. It doesn't matter what undergraduate major you are. But once you're in law school, when you're participating in a number of clinics and opportunities, including criminal justice clinics and so forth, that may pique your interest. And then ultimately, you have to make a decision whether you want to go and work for government, whether that's on the defense side like Saif, or on the prosecution side like Ossama, or ultimately do private practice. That's your decision. But to get the best experience, I think, is the best answer to that. I also see a number of anonymous questions, really good questions actually, about policing. I'll raise this question that's come up. This is a question from Rabia Chaudhry. She says, Assalamu alaikum, I joined late, but I apologize, but I wanted to make sure this was covered. What about social workers, mental health counselors, educators? They need to be a part of the system. How can we use those constituents to fight and break down systems of oppression and injustice? So Ossama, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's why it's really important to have a good public defender in situations like that. Because as a prosecutor, sometimes our role or sometimes our mindset might be a little bit limited in terms of what we think might be possible or reasonable for a defendant that we're working with. When we see a defendant, we just kind of see their rap sheet. We just see their criminal history. We don't see their full life history. And that's where a public defender or a private defense attorney that's really involved with their client can really kind of share those details of what's going on in a certain individual's circumstance. And that's why when you have certain informal resolutions, certain plea deals, you can have certain situations where people go into therapy, they go into in-house, they go into these different avenues and where they can address some common issues that they might have. And that's why, as prosecutors, we're trying to look for justice. We're trying to look for ways that can correct that individual, but also provide justice to the entire situation, justice to the victim. So that's why prosecutors are generally minded towards prosecution, because jail and imprisonment is always seen as, the way to get that type of justice for a victim. But at the end of the day, it may not be justice for society if that person is continuously to commit those same crimes, continuously to engage in that same behavior because of a mental issue. But of course, as a prosecutor, we don't get the full spectrum. So we need a good public defender that really explains those things, really kind of lays those things out. We cannot, once that person is retained by counsel, we cannot just directly talk to them. We have to talk to their counsel only. And so, those options are available. Those options are looked into. But we have to realize that when you're in the structure of the criminal justice system, you're looking ultimately at imprisonment. You're looking at those things as solutions, and they sometimes shouldn't always be. I think Saif might be able to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, Saif, please enlighten us a little bit about your experience. Thank you, Ossama. Very good.
Welcome. Yes, just like Ossama said. So one of the things that I do for every single case, Criminal Law 101, is give the DA, give the prosecutor a reason to give my client a break, which is essentially humanizing. Show that this isn't just John Smith. This is John Smith who went to high school here, grew up here. He did community service here and there, goes to the church here and there, whatever it may be, because it's much more difficult to be unjust to somebody who you're looking at a picture of, the face of, you know, as a human being instead of just a number. And then the prong number two that I like to do is I like to give the prosecutor a reason why they won't see my client again. Why, if it's a domestic violence case, before he's ever showed up in court, I have him enrolled in a domestic violence class. If there's needs that are social service needs, I will try to find whatever social services I can to help them. But I wanted to add that part of our system, for example, you know, here in California, in Orange County, I think a lot of places, the funding for the prosecutor's office is usually a lot higher than it is for the defense office. And so we don't always have the ability and the access and the funds to be able to hire experts in every single case there is. And that also goes down towards our whole situation right now, the economics of being able to stay out of jail versus not staying out of jail, and how that correlates to you know, the implicit racism that we've had in this country, and that's put those people in those positions. So it's extremely important. And just to touch real fast, I know we're at short on time. There were some questions with regards to refunding and defunding the police. And I think the main thing to look at when we talk about peace officers, and we look at other countries like Germany or France, in their police forces, they have social workers. They have these people that are actually sworn officers. And it's a very small amount that we'll have here. We might have some gang liaison or something like that, or somebody with regards to DARE to keep kids off drugs, some officers for that, but not actual trained, educated social workers who should be sent out to certain situations, nonviolent situations. And I think we would have a much better response in that case.
Mm-hmm. We'll take, we're at the hour and a half mark, going into the last half hour. I don't want to extend it too much, but we have some more hands. We have a little bit of time here. So let's take a few more. Sister Khadija Malik, we'll unmute your line if you want to ask a question. Khadija Malik.
Assalamu alaikum, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Firstly, I wanted to say this is my first time joining one of these webinars. I'm not sure if I'm sure they've been done in the past, but I recently joined the group chat. I really appreciate this community because I was really not aware that we had something like this. I'm really proud to be of a part of this group chat and having this community as Ahmadis. I just graduated from undergrad, and I just started as a paralegal at the New York District Attorney's Office. And I'm hoping, inshallah, to go to law school. I'm not sure yet. I want to see how things go. I have two questions, actually. So I know that some of you have mentioned how, as attorneys, you can, be a better voice, and when you are prosecuting these cases and when you are taking a look at rap sheets, then you're looking at more of a backstory of the person as opposed to just looking at how many times they've been arrested and all that. So how can if you have any advice, how can I, as justice support staff, paralegal, can convince my attorney as just someone lower than them to hey, we should look back at their history as opposed to just looking at the facts or what's on paper, because that's one of the reasons I wanted to join the district attorney's office, is to have more voices, as we all want to be more voices of justice. So I wanted to ask, how can I do that, if there's any advice as a paralegal currently?
Yeah, I think, not to pass the question to someone else, but after I speak, I've never worked in a prosecutor or DA's office, but I think there's many ways that you could do that, just by even just the first step would be having that awareness in our minds and having that alternative conception of innocence and guilt from what maybe many of the prosecutors in your office will have. I think that could even be the first step for you bringing some change into that office, rather than, the typical judgment that the prosecutors might have just after reading the police report. And I think another thing would be to listen to, what the public defender side says regarding humanizing that person, rather than just viewing them as the list of charges or counts on their rap sheet.
Mm-hmm. That's very good. I think you worked at a prosecution office, Ossama. Did you work with paralegals? Do you have any advice for Sister Khadija?
Yeah, Jazakallah for the question. I think as DAs, we are really inundated with a lot of work. I remember every weekend, I would have a stack of police reports with me that I have to go home and review and then decide on the charging decision. And, you know, a lot of patience to my wife for dealing with me during that time. And then especially when jury trials came around, then I was really out for the whole weekend. But the support staff are really important, and they all have kind of really key defined roles in helping the DA, helping the prosecutors prosecute the cases. But, you know, if you really want to kind of help out in terms of like answering your question of shedding a fuller perspective of the defendant, then you might want to work with, you know, the investigators that are in the DA office. They are sworn peace officers. They're former police officers that joined the DA's office and help in investigation. And sometimes some of their roles is considering some social media research, some type of research on the defendant to understand more about them. And I think you have to just maybe reach out with the investigators in your office, see that it's something that you like to be involved in, you like to help out with, and then use that as an avenue to kind of, you know, further that track to assist the DA. I mean, in reality, as a paralegal, as a support staff, your role is whatever it is that you're designed to do, whether that's to help with filing, whether with calendaring, whatever it might be. But if you want to kind of go above and beyond and see how you might be able to help, you might want to help those people that are already doing those type of things, like the investigators, and then just, you know, say you want to volunteer and assist.
And Khadija, you can post your we're question. We want to make sure we're fair to everyone, so please go ahead and post a second. I've seen a question here. We have a number of anonymous questions. This is one, I have heard some prisons get paid for providing cheap labor, primarily in the southern states, to the farmers who used to benefit from the free labor during slavery. Is that true? Abdul, Latif, you grew up in the South. You have a comment or thought on that question?
Yes, I believe it is true. Some prisons, some of the private prisons in particular, have contracts to both provide, produce things other than license plates, furniture. Some companies, some private prisons provide services for the public works department and get paid for it. That is doing stuff along the roads and stuff like this. The prisoners are supposed to be getting paid something for everything that they do, even if they're doing it in the office or in the prison type job. But it may be 10 cents a day, maybe 25 cents a day for a kitchen gig. It may be $1 for a road gig. It's nowhere near anything approaching anything like about a minimum wage. And of course they can only use it on commissary kind of stuff, that is the cigarettes and stuff, again, giving it right back to the prison, you know? But yes, I don't know a particular one that they're talking about, but it is very common for prisons to work for pennies, literally, and to provide a service for which the private prisons reap profits. It's common.
Mm-hmm. We can have a one-sentence answer to these questions coming up. So Saif, this is to you. Is it a conflict of interest for police departments to investigate the murders committed by their own officers?
I definitely think it is, I think that almost kind of speaks for itself. If any group of people we can call a gang, it would be the police department, and who cover each other. So that doesn't make sense as itself. Also, one of the things with regards to you know, if a prosecutor decides to take a case to trial, or an officer makes an arrest, the prosecutor takes it to trial, and I win in court, and I walk the guy out not guilty, that officer doesn't even get a phone call letting him know what happened unless he specifically asked that prosecutor to let him know. He could have gone up there, testified, lied under oath. You know, the jury believed that he was lying and found the guy not guilty, and there's no repercussion for him whatsoever. Ossama might be able to answer with regards to the DA's office, but the same thing where, you know, the DA, other than losing a little bit of face because he lost, is not going to have, he's not going to be told, hey, you shouldn't have taken that case to trial, or you shouldn't have prosecuted that trial, unless they thought the facts were not something that were going to result in a win. So that's one of the things with, I mean, police, the repercussion for police is minimal, and the repercussion as well for prosecutorial misconduct as well is usually pretty minimal. And I think those are two things that hopefully we can reform as well, which might help.
Yeah. Two more questions we'll take, and we'll conclude in 5 minutes here.
When a person is expunged, how deep can a police department dig into an expungement?
I can answer that pretty I think it's different for every state. In California, an expungement, you're not lying when you say you've not been convicted of a crime. However, there are certain exceptions, specifically when you're applying to government jobs in which that doesn't come into play, and also when it comes to priorability. So if a charge is a priorable charge, even if it's been expunged, it can be used against you for prosecution of a new case. So the police arrest reports are completely different. So people do get confused. Getting an arrest sealed is very different than getting a conviction expunged. Getting arrest sealed, meaning if you got falsely arrested and were never charged, is a very high standard. It's a very high standard. It's almost actual innocence standard to be able to get an arrest sealed. But an expungement, it's much lower. It's finishing the terms of your probation successfully. There could be some other factors required, but most cases can be expunged unless they are serious or violent felonies, specific sex cases, things like that.
Very good. We'll take Omer Khan. You have a question?
Hello, Assalamu alaikum.
Yes, go ahead, Omer.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum. My question was in regards to, I guess it's more of a general question, that public defenders have this rep that they're always, the person they're defending, they're always just told to just cop the plea without even putting in that full-fledged effort to fight that person's case. So if anybody could expound on that, I guess.
Okay. Abdul Latif, go ahead.
Yes.
Earlier.
I did. And the last time that I was in federal court, I got a case from an attorney who had pled guilty, who persuaded our client to plead guilty after a 15-minute consultation. The client later had second thoughts and he came to me. My first hurdle was to get the judge to withdraw the guilty plea. So we filed a petition for the judge to withdraw the guilty plea. The judge said that he will listen to the facts, but he says they had because he entered it, they had the full, voir dire on the record where he said, yes, he knows what he's doing. Yes, he's doing it of sound mind, et cetera, et cetera. But then the judge says that to overcome this, you got a high bar, Mr. Bennett. Turns out that the judge allowed a magistrate to hear the conversation between my client and the attorney agreed that it was after a 15-minute consultation. He agreed that he said that he knew the judge and that he was probably going to get a little probation. And this was no way the judge was going to give him probation on this kind of case. So long story short, the judge sent it out, came back and allowed us to withdraw the guilty plea because the attorney got a good 10 grand just for a 15-minute consultation, and the guy wanted to take it to the mat after having reconsidered. So attorneys do that all of the time. Defense attorneys love to take the easy way out, and that's another reason why some of us give it up, because either you get to a point where you don't care and you just want to get in and out of this thing as possible, or you take it to heart and you sleep with these things and you live with these things.
Saif is one of those who hasn't given it up, Saif, right?
That's why I commend him.
And I understand where she's coming from. I've been called dump truck. I've been called public pretender many times. And the one that hurts the most is when my client, who I've just gotten out of jail or whatever, says, hey, so one day do you want to become a lawyer? And I have to explain to them, we are all real lawyers. Public defenders are extremely overworked, and there are great and there are bad public defenders, just like great cops and bad cops. So I just wanted to add that in. So of course there are bad ones who aren't doing this for the right reason, but I just want to add as well, there are people that I've seen that I've worked with for many years, these public defenders. Some of these people are very different from us when it comes to our moral beliefs, things like that. Some of them might not even be all the way, they might even be some atheists there. But some of these people, the way they represent and work tirelessly for other people, I get, I'm in awe of it. And some of these people don't have this moral compass that we're using, and I'm wondering where it comes from them. So I have a lot of respect for public defenders, not just because I was one, but because I know the difficulty of it, and also being asked every day, every Sunday or every Friday when you're at the masjid of how do you defend guilty people, and having to give a response to somebody, which I think Hazur has now given us the best response for it, and with regards to absolute justice. So I just wanted to add that in.
I just want to make one.
Yeah,
just
go
one,
ahead, Ossama.
I was just gonna make one note. You know, I think as a society, we don't appreciate those things that are just going to be given to us for free. And public defenders, it's a right that, you know, and a defendant has a right to a public defender, and they may not appreciate that. What they don't realize is that public defender often can get a much better deal than a private defense attorney, just because when you're a prosecutor, you're hanging out once a week for at least, you know, half a day with that public defender, going over cases, going over hearings, and you build a relationship with that person just to that fact. And if that person is a reasonable person and that person is someone you can work with, and they want to give a deal on certain people, I'm more than likely willing to listen to that person than a private defense attorney who I don't really know what their intentions are, you know. So I think, you know, it's an unfortunate reality that public defenders are sometimes thrown under the bus, but in reality, they can be some of your best counsel.
Mm. We're out of time, and we have the final question I'll ask, and I think Sister Hamida, you can take this. It's from Manzoor Rahman. He says, what is the chance? What is the chance that the proposed reforms to what he says is this paper tiger legal system will come about in the foreseeable future?
I mean, that's the big question. And I think, you know, when you sit through a call like this and you hear all of the issues that we're facing, the troubles that we have to overcome, you know, it can feel insurmountable. But I mean, I'm an immigration attorney. I work with kids. I have to work within a system, a legislative system that can be very difficult for children who are seeking asylum and are seeking who are, you know, escaping really difficult situations and are trying to survive. And similarly, in our own country, there are so many communities that are marginalized. But I think that, you know, as a Muslim and as a lawyer, again, I kind of go back to the fact that it is a noble profession, that we should aspire to change. And I think it's possible. I think we have to be realistic in the time frame that it takes. But I think if you are someone who finds these issues compelling, whether it's because you are a lawyer or aspire to be a lawyer, or you don't have any legal training, you know, maybe you want to be a social worker, a teacher, whatever it is, we all have to try and participate. And whether that is voting, whether that is maybe being more positive about our public defenders who are doing this very hard work, whether that is reading the Quran and listening to Huzur's teaching, I think we have to believe that that change can happen. And it only will happen if we are participating and we are focused on ways that we can change our own selves and our own perspectives, and then also take those beliefs to the streets and take it to the courthouses and take it to the ballot boxes and really bring that passion in a way that small, you know, many hands make light work. If we are all participating, inshallah, you know, that's what I get up every day. And I think about the kids that I work with, the attorneys that I'm assisting and representing their clients. That's what really drives me every day to do the work I do. So I think we should try to be optimistic, realistic, but optimistic.
Very well put, Hamida. I really wanted to thank everyone. I do want to mention here that Hazur has given so many nuggets of wisdom on this last point that Sister Hamida so beautifully encapsulated. He said that we must participate and exercise our democratic rights to force people in positions of power to act with justice, right? You work within the system, you exercise your rights, you work on those rights, you call out injustices in the system, you work to reform them, to force people to act with justice. And this is really the essence, right, of these three beautiful principles in Islam of absolute justice being just a minimum floor, but showing the benevolence and ultimately loving another as if they're your own kin. These are the sublime the sublime goals that Islam offers a prescription for this legal system. The prescription and solution lies in these beautiful teachings of Islam. I hope and pray that this conversation is just getting us started to talk about these issues more robustly. Stay tuned for other programming in the Jamaat with the Supreme Justice campaign that's around the corner. It's already underway. The Alliance for Absolute Justice program that the Tabligh Department has launched. Also more programming from the Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association. So Jazakallah everyone for joining. For those of you who couldn't ask your questions, we'll try to capture these and respond to you offline as well. At the end here, I would like to ask for a concluding dua, and Brother Abdul Latif, if you may lead us in silent prayers, please.
Dua kale. Allahumma ameen.
Ameen. Jazakallah everyone for joining. Have a good evening. Assalamu alaikum.